1944, somewhere in the Pacific, at a makeshift American POW camp surrounded by rustling palms and the distant echo of waves. The war had torn through everything: honor, pride, and even hunger itself. Days earlier, a group of weary Japanese soldiers had been captured. Their uniforms hung loosely from their thin frames, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked from thirst and silence. When the trucks finally stopped at the camp gates, they expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps even death. But what awaited them inside was something entirely different. A long wooden table stretched across the mess hall, bathed in the soft amber glow of lanterns. The air smelled of roasted beef, freshly baked bread, and steaming rice, a scent none of them had known since before the war began. American soldiers moved calmly, setting plates, pouring coffee, and arranging food with quiet respect. The prisoners stood motionless, their hands trembling. Then one of them whispered, barely audible, "Is this really for us?" No one answered. The only sound was the gentle clatter of utensils and the hum of the electric fan above. When the first prisoner stepped forward and tasted the food, his composure shattered. Tears welled up. Others followed, their emotions breaking through years of propaganda, fear, and hate. In that simple human act, a meal, enemies became men again. 1944, somewhere in the Pacific, at a makeshift American prisoner of war camp surrounded by rustling palms and the smell of salt carried in from the nearby sea. The sun was setting, its last golden light brushing over the distant hills and glinting off the barbed wire fences that lined the compound. The trucks rolled in slowly, their engines growling through the heavy tropical air. Inside, 24 Japanese soldiers sat in silence. Their uniforms were torn, their bodies exhausted, their eyes sunken deep into hollow faces. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rattle of the truck bed, the clinking of metal buckles, and the soft cough of a man whose lungs could no longer hold the damp air. When the convoy stopped, the American guards stepped forward. Their movements were firm, rehearsed, but not cruel. They didn't shout. They didn't shove. Orders were given in calm voices, gestures more than words, as the prisoners were told to dismount. Slowly the men climbed down, one by one. Some stumbled as their weakened legs met solid ground for the first time in days. The guards caught them without a word and steadied them. That more than anything unnerved the prisoners. They had been told 1,000 times what to expect if captured by the enemy. The Americans were monsters. That's what they had been taught. They tortured, they humiliated, they erased honor. But here, standing before these foreign soldiers, the men felt something they had not prepared for. Not cruelty, not hatred, just silence. The camp before them was not the hell they had imagined. It was simple but organized. Rows of wooden barracks stretched neatly behind the gates, their roofs patched with tin sheets that caught the last glimmers of sunlight. Smoke drifted lazily from a kitchen area nearby, carrying with it a smell that hit them like a ghost from another life. Food. Real food, rice, meat, bread. Their stomachs clenched painfully at the scent. But none dared to look directly toward it. The American officer in charge, a tall man with rolled-up sleeves and a clipboard in hand, gave a few short commands. The guards translated in broken Japanese, "Line up." Medical check. Then barracks. The words were plain, but to men who expected beatings, the tone itself felt strange, almost respectful. A medic moved among them next. He checked their wounds, their fevers, their sunburned skin. When one soldier flinched as the medic touched his arm, the man simply nodded and spoke softly. "It's all right." The prisoner blinked in confusion. No interpreter needed. The tone was universal, gentle. He looked away quickly, ashamed of the tears that had begun to form. As they were led deeper into the camp, a few of the prisoners dared to glance at the surroundings. They saw other men, fellow Japanese captives, walking freely within the fenced perimeter, not chained or beaten. Some were sweeping the ground, others talking quietly near the water station. An old man, probably a sergeant, whispered to the young soldier beside him, "They let them walk?" The boy nodded slowly, his face pale, unable to comprehend. The group was led to their assigned quarters, a long wooden hut with open windows that let in the evening breeze. Inside, rows of bunks lined the walls, each with a thin but clean mattress, a folded blanket, and a small metal cup placed neatly on a stool. One soldier, trembling, touched the fabric of the blanket as if expecting it to disappear. It was rough but warm. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at it, unable to move. Outside, the sound of footsteps echoed. American guards making their rounds. Yet their steps were measured, never heavy or threatening. The prisoners listened closely, waiting for the next command, but none came. Only the low hum of a generator filled the silence. One of them whispered, "Maybe this is just the beginning. Maybe the punishment starts tomorrow." Another replied, "No. If they wanted us dead, they'd have done it already." Their words hung in the air, uncertain, fragile. Night fell quickly. The camp lights flickered on, dim bulbs strung across poles that buzzed softly in the humid air. The prisoners sat together, saying little, their minds filled with thoughts they dared not share aloud. The distant sound of laughter drifted from the American mess hall. It was casual, unguarded, the kind of laughter that belonged to men who knew they were safe. The prisoners could not remember what that felt like. A young Japanese corporal, barely in his 20s, looked out the window toward the light. His name was Hideo. Before the war, he had worked in a small shop in Nagasaki. He had been taught that capture was dishonor, that mercy from the enemy was weakness. Yet now, as he watched an American guard share a cigarette with another prisoner, he felt something he couldn't explain. Confusion, shame, relief, and hunger. His stomach growled softly. The man beside him chuckled dryly. "You're not the only one." They both smiled faintly, the first trace of humanity to pass between them since capture. A guard appeared at the door. "Dinner soon," he said in accented Japanese. Then he pointed toward the mess hall. "You come quietly." The men exchanged glances. Dinner? For them? It had to be a trick. Perhaps a display of false kindness before interrogation. Still, hunger overpowered fear. As they stepped out of the barracks, the air had cooled, and the moon hung low over the palm trees. The path to the mess hall was lit by lanterns. Each flickering flame cast long shadows across the dirt, painting the camp in gold and grey. The prisoners walked in single file, their footsteps soft, their eyes darting from one unfamiliar sight to another. Americans laughing near a truck, a radio playing faint jazz in the background, the smell of coffee mixing with roasted meat. None of it made sense. When they reached the hall, they saw the tables, long, wooden, carefully arranged. Steam rose from metal trays lined with food, rice, vegetables, bread, and what looked like beef stew. The guards motioned for them to sit. No one moved at first. They stood frozen, staring. "Sit," the guard repeated, his voice firm but not angry. They obeyed. The benches creaked beneath their weight as they sat stiffly, hands resting on their knees. They expected more soldiers to enter, perhaps to mock them or make them wait. Instead, the Americans began serving the food, not throwing it, not shouting, but placing each plate gently before the prisoners. The smell was overwhelming. Warm, rich, unfamiliar, it carried memories of home, of mothers cooking rice over open fires, of dinners before the war turned everything to ashes. One man couldn't stop his hands from shaking. He clenched them into fists to hide it. The officer who had greeted them earlier walked in. He looked around the hall, his eyes calm, his expression unreadable. Then he said, in a tone that carried both authority and humanity, "Eat." It was a single word, but it hit them harder than any bullet. No one moved for several seconds. Then slowly, one of the older soldiers picked up a spoon. He hesitated, whispering something to himself, a prayer, maybe an apology. When the first bite touched his tongue, his eyes widened. The taste was real. The food was real. He swallowed, and then, without warning, tears began to roll down his face. The others watched him, stunned. Then one by one they began to eat. The room filled with the soft clatter of spoons and muffled sobs. Some of the men hid their faces in their hands. Others simply stared at their plates, unable to comprehend the kindness they were receiving from those they had called demons. The guards stood by silently, watching. They didn't interfere. They didn't speak. For that brief moment, the war outside those walls didn't exist. Later that night, back in their barracks, the prisoners lay awake. The air was still warm, but the fear had lifted. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew they would never forget it. For the first time in months, their bellies were full. And for the first time in years, their hearts felt something close to peace. The bell rang just after sunset, a low metallic clang that echoed through the humid evening air. It was the call to dinner. The Japanese prisoners, still uncertain of what awaited them, stood in formation outside their barracks. They had been at the camp for only a few hours, yet every minute felt unreal. Too calm, too civilized for what they had been told to expect from the enemy. The American guards motioned for them to move toward the mess hall. No rifles were raised, no shouting accompanied the order. The prisoners hesitated for a heartbeat, exchanging wary glances before stepping forward in silence. Their boots scuffed the packed earth, kicking up soft clouds of dust that drifted lazily under the lantern light. The mess hall stood at the far end of the compound, a long, wooden structure with wide doors thrown open to let in the night air. Inside, the yellow glow of hanging lamps spread across the room, illuminating rows of polished tables. The faint hum of a generator underscored the gentle clinking of utensils as American soldiers arranged plates and metal cups with quiet precision. To the prisoners, it looked less like a military camp and more like a strange dream. They could smell it before they stepped inside, a mix of roasted meat, cooked vegetables, and fresh bread. The aroma hit them like a wave. It was rich, heavy, and almost unbearable for men who had been living for weeks on thin rice soup and stale biscuits. Hunger twisted inside them like a knife. Yet even as their bodies screamed for food, their minds could not trust it. They had been trained since boyhood to expect humiliation in defeat. Surrender was shame, and mercy was mockery. What if this was a cruel test? What if the Americans were to watch them eat, laugh at them, perhaps even take the food away? The thought made their hands tremble. But still, they followed the guard's gestures and stepped through the doorway. The sudden brightness of the hall made them squint. The noise of distant conversation hushed as they entered. American soldiers, young, tanned, some with rolled-up sleeves, others with cigarettes between their fingers, turned their heads to look. But there were no jeers, no insults. One of the men near the door even nodded slightly, as if in greeting. "Sit," one of the guards said simply, pointing to the benches that lined both sides of the table. The prisoners obeyed. Wood creaked beneath them as they sat stiffly, their backs straight, hands resting on their knees. No one reached for the food that sat before them. Not yet. Steam rose from the plates, curling upward into the lamplight. The dishes looked almost ceremonial, thick slices of beef stew simmering in dark gravy, rice piled neatly in bowls, green beans glistening with butter, and slices of bread that still carried the warmth of the oven. The smell was so overwhelming, it almost felt cruel. For several moments, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with uncertainty. Then, as if on cue, the American cooks began serving more food, ladles dipping into pots, plates being refilled. There was no mockery in their actions, no signs of superiority. They served the prisoners the same way they served their own men. A murmur spread among the Japanese soldiers. "Is this for us?" one whispered in disbelief. No answer came, but when one of the Americans set a cup of coffee in front of him and moved on without a word, the message was clear. This was not a joke. This was not a trap. They stared at the meal before them, frozen. Their minds could not reconcile what their eyes saw. At the far end of the hall, an American officer stood quietly, arms crossed. He surveyed the room for a moment, then spoke a few calm words. The interpreter beside him translated, "You fought bravely. You are soldiers. The war is outside these walls. Here you are prisoners, but you will be treated with respect. Eat." The last word hung in the air like a release of tension that had been wound too tight. The oldest among them, a former sergeant, his face lined with dust and age, was the first to move. He bowed his head slightly, murmured something in Japanese, and lifted his spoon. The others watched as he took the first bite. He chewed slowly, almost painfully, his eyes closing as if afraid to wake from the dream. When he swallowed, his shoulders shook. The spoon fell from his hand, clattering softly against the metal plate. Tears rolled down his cheeks. It was as if his composure, the last fragment of his soldier's pride, had finally broken. The others followed. One by one, spoons lifted, food touched lips, and disbelief gave way to emotion. Hunger, gratitude, confusion, it all collided inside them. Some ate cautiously, almost reverently. Others devoured the meal, as if afraid it might vanish. A few simply sat staring, unable to eat at all, watching the steam rise from their plates while silent tears traced lines through the grime on their faces. The Americans said nothing. They sat at their own tables and ate quietly, pretending not to notice, though many of them did. Some of the younger soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, not sure what to make of the sight, enemies weeping over food. One man, perhaps moved by the moment, pushed a small tin of jam toward a prisoner at the next table. The prisoner hesitated, then bowed deeply before taking it. In that gesture, brief, wordless, an invisible barrier cracked. The room was filled with the sounds of eating, but beneath it was something deeper, a silence that felt sacred. For years, both sides had been told that the other was inhuman. Yet here, under the hum of a flickering light, they ate the same food, breathed the same air, and shared the same exhaustion that war carved into all men. One young prisoner, barely 18, ate slowly and looked across the table at an American who was watching him. Their eyes met, just for a second, and the boy quickly looked down. But the American smiled faintly, lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast, and returned to his meal. The boy's lips parted in something that might have been a smile, or perhaps disbelief that kindness could still exist in this world. Somewhere near the kitchen, an old radio played softly, the faint crackle of a 1940s tune drifting between the wooden walls. It was an American melody, one none of the Japanese men recognized, yet it soothed the room like a distant lullaby. The sergeant who had wept earlier now sat straighter. Between bites, he whispered to the man beside him, "My wife used to make rice like this." The other man nodded silently, tears still glistening on his face. Around them, similar murmurs rose, fragments of memory breaking through years of numbness. One spoke of his village, another of a child he hadn't seen in 3 years. The war had taken their humanity. This meal was giving it back, piece by fragile piece. The American officer walked between the tables, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. He didn't speak, but every step seemed to echo with unspoken understanding. When he reached the end of the hall, he paused, looked back at the rows of weary faces, and then left quietly. For nearly an hour, the men ate in silence. Plates emptied, cups refilled. When the meal was over, the prisoners did not rush to leave. They sat there staring at the remains of food, crumbs, empty bowls, bits of rice, as though afraid that standing up would end the spell. The guards finally gestured for them to return to their barracks. The prisoners rose slowly, bowing slightly toward the kitchen as they left. A few of the Americans nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. Outside, the night air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain. Crickets chirped in the grass beyond the wire fence. As they walked back, one soldier whispered, "They ate the same as we did." Another replied softly, "Maybe they're not like what we were told." Back in their quarters, the men lay awake. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering bulb by the door. Some of them stared at the ceiling. Others clasped their hands and murmured prayers. For the first time in months, their bellies were full, but it was not only food that filled them. It was confusion, humility, and a strange, quiet warmth that none could describe. Hideo, the young corporal, pulled the blanket over his shoulders and thought about home, about his mother, about the rice she used to cook when he was a child. The memory made his throat tighten. He realized that the food he had eaten tonight, given by the very men he was told to hate, had brought that memory back from the ashes. Outside, the rain began to fall. Soft, steady, cleansing. It drummed gently against the tin roofs, washing the dust from the day. Somewhere near the mess hall, a guard put out his cigarette and turned off the radio. The camp fell into silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the rain, and in that silence the impossible had happened. For a brief, fragile night, compassion had crossed the front lines. The rain had stopped by midnight, leaving behind a stillness that seemed almost sacred. The camp lay in silence, the kind of silence that only comes after exhaustion, deep, heavy, complete. Beyond the wire fences, the jungle whispered softly in the dark, and somewhere far off, a night bird called. Inside the barracks, the Japanese prisoners lay awake on their bunks, staring into the dim light of a single flickering bulb. None of them could sleep. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were restless. What they had experienced that evening, the meal, the kindness, the quiet respect, had shaken something deep inside them. It wasn't just the food. It was what the food represented. It was the moment their image of the enemy cracked and began to crumble. Hideo sat near the window, his blanket wrapped tightly around him. The night air was damp and cool. He could see the glow of the lanterns outside, faint against the mist rising from the ground. Drops of water clung to the barbed wire, glimmering like beads of glass in the moonlight. Every so often he heard footsteps, an American guard making his rounds. The sound no longer made him tense. It was rhythmic, steady, even reassuring. He turned his gaze to the other men in the room. Some were whispering quietly, others just lying still, with their hands clasped on their chests, eyes open, staring at the wooden ceiling. The sergeant who had wept at dinner was sitting upright, his back against the wall, eyes closed, perhaps lost in prayer. The smell of cooked food still lingered faintly in the air. Beef, rice, bread, a reminder of what had happened only hours earlier. Hideo whispered, "Sergeant." The older man opened his eyes and looked at him. "Why do you think they did it?" Hideo asked softly. "Why feed us like that? We are their enemies." The sergeant took a slow breath. "I've been asking myself the same thing," he replied. His voice was low and steady, each word deliberate. "Maybe it's because they don't see us the way we see them. Maybe to them, we are just soldiers. Like them." Hideo frowned. The words didn't sit easily with him. "But they're the enemy. We were taught—" "I know what we were taught," the sergeant interrupted gently. "That they're savages, heartless, without honor. But look at us. Did those men look like monsters tonight?" Hideo didn't answer. He remembered the faces of the American soldiers, tired, young, sunburned. Not cruel, not mocking, just human. He remembered how one of them had given him an extra piece of bread with a quiet smile. That gesture had struck him harder than any insult could. "No," he finally said. "They didn't." The sergeant nodded slowly. "War makes us forget what people are," he murmured. "It makes us forget that even enemies have families, homes, reasons." He paused, eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. Maybe tonight was their way of reminding us, and themselves, that we're all still men. Across the room, another soldier spoke up. His name was Tanaka, a thin, wiry man with sharp eyes that still carried the hardness of combat. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "Kindness from an enemy? Maybe it's strategy. Maybe they want to soften us, make us weak." The sergeant turned his head toward him. "Weakness doesn't come from kindness," he said quietly. "It comes from forgetting who we are." Tanaka fell silent. For a long time, no one spoke. The hum of the light filled the room, and the rain began again, soft and steady, drumming gently on the tin roof. Hideo lay back on his bunk and stared up at the ceiling. His stomach was full, something he hadn't felt in weeks, but it wasn't comfort that kept him awake. It was the confusion of everything that had happened. His thoughts drifted to his home in Nagasaki, to his mother's garden, the sound of his father sharpening tools in the yard, the scent of rice cooking on the stove. The memory was so vivid it hurt. He had buried those thoughts long ago, believing they had no place in war. Yet tonight they had returned, carried on the simple warmth of food. He wondered if the Americans thought of their homes too. if they had mothers waiting, families hoping they'd survive. Perhaps they weren't so different after all. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The hours passed. The camp gradually fell into deeper quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of a bunk or the cough of a sleeping man. Hideo couldn't tell when he finally drifted into sleep, but when he did, it was not filled with fear or nightmares. Only the faint memory of kindness. The next morning dawned grey and heavy. A thin fog blanketed the camp, softening every sound. The prisoners were woken by the clang of a bell. They rose slowly, still sore, still cautious, and gathered outside. The air smelled of wet earth and boiled coffee. Breakfast was simpler than the feast the night before. Porridge, a slice of bread, and hot water. Yet the men accepted it gratefully. There was no tension this time, no disbelief. They ate quietly, and when one of the Americans passed by with a pot to refill cups, a few of the Japanese soldiers nodded in thanks. Small gestures, hesitant, uncertain, but real. The guards noticed. They didn't respond in words, only returned the nods with faint smiles. After breakfast, the prisoners were given work, clearing debris, fixing fences, organizing supplies. It was strange labor, neither harsh nor humiliating. The guards watched but did not shout. When one man cut his hand on a splinter, an American medic immediately stepped in, bandaging it with care. The injured man bowed repeatedly, his voice trembling with gratitude. By midday, the fog lifted, revealing the sky, a soft, endless blue. The camp was calm. The prisoners moved with quiet discipline, no longer driven by fear, but by a subtle, shared respect. The Americans treated them not as enemies, but as men with dignity. It was disorienting, almost more difficult to process than cruelty. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mood in the barracks was different. The men spoke more openly now, their voices steady, reflective. Tanaka, who had doubted the Americans' intentions, sat by the door, cleaning his hands with a rag. "I think I was wrong," he said finally. "They could have starved us." "They didn't," the sergeant nodded. "Mercy can be a weapon, too," he said softly, "but this doesn't feel like that. This feels human," Hideo added quietly. "Maybe they fed us not because they had to, but because they wanted to remind us we're all still alive." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, fragile but real. One of the older prisoners, who had barely spoken since capture, began humming a tune, an old Japanese folk song, slow and sorrowful. The others listened, the sound blending with the rustle of the night breeze through the open window. It was a song of home, of distance, of longing. And when he finished, one of the Americans standing guard outside, perhaps recognizing the emotion if not the words, gave a low whistle in appreciation. Inside, the prisoners smiled faintly. For the first time since the war began, the invisible line dividing them and their captors didn't feel so sharp. Later that evening, Hideo sat outside for a moment, looking up at the moon. It was full and bright, the same moon his mother could see from home. The camp was quiet again, guards pacing softly, the jungle breathing around them. He thought about how strange it was that a single meal could change so much. Not the outcome of the war, not history, but something inside the heart. The propaganda that had filled his head for years had said the enemy had no soul. Yet tonight he had seen compassion in their faces, the kind that no army could fake. He wondered if the Americans saw the same humanity in him. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Maybe the enemy is not who we thought." It wasn't an act of surrender, it was an awakening. He thought of the young American soldier who had smiled at him at dinner. The man's eyes soft, his manner without arrogance. Perhaps somewhere across the ocean, that soldier's family thought of him the same way Hideo's mother thought of her son. Worried, proud, hoping for survival. War had made them enemies, but mercy, simple, uncalculated mercy, had made them men again. The rain began again, light and steady. It tapped softly against the tin roofs, each drop a quiet rhythm echoing through the camp. The sound was soothing like a heartbeat. The prisoners returned to their bunks one by one, their movements slow, deliberate. Some prayed, some wept silently. Some simply lay back and stared at the ceiling, trying to hold on to the fleeting feeling of peace that had found them in the most unlikely of places. No one spoke of the future. No one spoke of death or victory. For one night, the war outside had faded away, replaced by something pure, the fragile recognition that humanity could still exist amid ruin. In the morning, the fighting would go on. The world would return to chaos. But tonight, inside that quiet camp beneath the rain and the moonlight, men who had once sworn to destroy each other shared the same silence, the same warmth, and perhaps unknowingly, the same prayer that one day there would be no more need for enemies.